The Eswatini Prime Minister is pleading with King Mswati to initiate talks with opposition parties. The people of Eswatini are calling for an end to the King's rule and for reforms. Christopher Vandome, researcher with the Chatham House Africa Programme, joins me now. Christopher, good to have you with us. So there's a call to speak to opposition parties. I mean, is the King taking any of this seriously? What is it that he can do to be a little more inclusive?
Well, I think at the moment, it's still not clear what the King's position is, or even perhaps where he is. In terms of what the way forward is, what's been really interesting about this set of protests compared to past protests is, one, particularly driven by youth, and secondly, that it's really a push for democracy, whereas past protests, although they've been pro-democratic, have largely been driven by unions who have a clear leadership. In terms of these protests, it's unclear as to who can they negotiate with in terms of the protests themselves, beyond going for political parties and progressing towards democracy. In terms of what could be done, I think most significantly would be the unbanning of political parties, and that's what the opposition parties are pushing for. Political parties were outlawed in Swaziland, now Eswatini, in 1973, and I think that that's clearly going to be a first step on a signal from the King that he's taking these protests seriously, that he takes democracy seriously, and this is something that, in reaction to past protests, he has shifted slightly. So, for example, in 2013, in the wake of pressure around the elections, he defined Swaziland then as a monarchical democracy. So there's been name changes in the past, but I think, again, clearly a first step, a serious step, would be looking at how political parties and political organisation can happen in Eswatini. But
you wonder why he would bother to change. I mean, he's been ruling this way for years. I mean, he doesn't obviously believe in democracy. I mean, what's going to force him to make this change? We know that SADC leaders are heading his way on Sunday. Could they make a difference?
They could. The issue with SADC and Eswatini is that they've never really had a cohesive position amongst all member states, and even the South Africans, who perhaps have the most leverage over in terms of economic leverage, have never had a cohesive position. So Eswatini is completely dependent economically on SACU customs receipts and import-exports through South Africa. So there are leverages there. But in the past, these haven't been used. But I think that the situation now is one where this is not a crisis that SADC really wants to have on its hands, especially what's going on in northern Mozambique and the attention that's being placed on that. So I think that they will want a swift resolution to what's going on in Eswatini, and they won't want this to drag on.
How much of a threat is an unstable Eswatini to the neighbouring countries?
Relatively low, and this is something that we've been following for over a decade now, which is that these protests and the push for democracy in Eswatini has been going on for a very long time, but because it's not such a threat to SADC and because it's not really an international threat, it receives very little international attention. And that's one of the things that's come out of the past couple of months, and particularly this week, is that for the first time, this is really being reported in international capitals and really being discussed seriously within the region.
I mean, it's a tragedy, isn't it, when you see what's been happening for decades in that country?
It is. Eswatini has one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, and it's also, if it was a South African province, its GDP would be the equivalent of, I think, either the 7th or 8th largest. So this is a very small place, very dependent on its neighbours, and yet at the same time, the King has pursued the legacy of his father in trying to distinguish the country from the region by creating this sense of nationhood around his own traditional authority. And including in that is the banning of political opposition and political parties, and the and quelling of dissent in this manner. And this includes today MTN acknowledging in the country that they were pressured by the government to turn the internet off. And this is something that we've seen elsewhere on the continent as well. But it shows that there is a real, this pressure that has been bubbling up is really coming to the fore. And as I said earlier, this isn't similar to what we've seen in the past in terms of protests organised by union leaders or opposition parties. There's something a bit more organic to this. There's something much more youth-driven, much more organic, and that really should be taken seriously.
Christopher, let's leave it there. Vandome, thank you very much for that.